The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a day otherwise indistinguishable from the mournful procession of late autumn days that had settled over Adrian Thorne's meticulously ordered, if somewhat sterile, existence. It was crisp, embossed with the letterhead of a legal firm he didn't recognize, Blackwood, and Finch, a name that echoed with the somber dignity of old money and even older secrets. Adrian, a man whose life had been a study in predictable routines and the quiet resignation of fading ambitions, slit the envelope with a silver letter opener, a relic from a more optimistic past. He was 47, an age where the body begins to keep a more accurate tally of the years than the mind prefers. His reflection, caught unawares in the polished surface of his mahogany desk, showed a man of distinguished features, certainly, but features undeniably etched by time. Hair that had once been a rich, dark brown was now generously threaded with silver, particularly at the temples, and the lines around his eyes, once mere crinkles of laughter, had deepened into permanent grooves of worry or perhaps simple weariness. He was a lecturer in antiquarian literature, a field that, much like himself, felt increasingly anachronistic in a world hurtling towards an ever brighter, ever noisier future. The solicitor's words were stark, devoid of sentiment. He, Adrian Thorne, was the sole surviving heir to the estate of his late great-uncle, Alistair Thorne, a man Adrian recalled only as a shadowy figure from childhood, a whispered name associated with eccentricity and reclusion. The estate in question was Blackwood Manor, situated in some remote, forgotten corner of the county he'd long since left behind. The name itself, Blackwood, conjured images of dense, lightless forests, of gnarled branches clawing at stormy skies. An involuntary shiver, cold and unexpected, traced its way down Adrian's spine. His first instinct, the pragmatic, modern instinct, was to sell, liquidate the asset, deal with the paperwork, and return to the comfortable, if unexciting, groove of his life. What use had he for a doubtless dilapidated country house, likely miles from anywhere, burdened with the accumulated neglect of a recluse? Yet, as the days passed, the name Blackwood Manor began to lodge itself in his thoughts, an insistent burr. There was a faint stirring of something he hadn't felt in years, curiosity, perhaps, or the ghost of an ancestral pull he couldn't quite define. Alistair Thorne. He remembered hushed family conversations, hints of strange pursuits, of an intellect that had veered from brilliance into something else, something darker. A week later, Adrian found himself driving a rented car down increasingly narrow, winding lanes, the sky above a bruised purple, threatening rain. The directions provided by the solicitor had been precise, yet the journey felt like a descent into another time. The villages he passed through were quaint, unnervingly so, their stone cottages huddled together, as if for protection against the encroaching wilderness. When he stopped at a small, dimly lit pub for directions, the mention of Blackwood Manor drew a curtain of silence over the few patrons nursing their Alish. Their eyes, when they met his, were guarded, laced with an unspoken wariness that did little to soothe his growing unease. "Aye, Blackwood," one old man finally grunted, his voice raspy as dry leaves. "Keeps to itself, that place. Always has." The final stretch of road was little more than a rutted track, overgrown with grasping brambles that scraped against the car's paintwork like skeletal fingers. And then, through a break in the gnarled, ancient trees that pressed in on either side, he saw it. Blackwood Manor. It was larger than he had imagined, a sprawling, Gothic structure of dark, weathered stone, its many mullioned windows like vacant eyes staring out from beneath heavy, moss-laden eaves. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, clawed at the walls, threatening to consume the house entirely. It wasn't grand in a welcoming way. It was imposing, melancholic, a monument to decay and forgotten histories. The air itself seemed heavier here, imbued with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a faint, almost metallic tang, like old blood or rusted iron. The The solicitor had left a key with a local agent, a nervous, twitchy man who had practically thrust it into Adrian's hand and retreated, muttering something about not liking the feel of the place after dark. With a sense of trepidation that was rapidly overshadowing his initial curiosity, Adrian approached the massive oak front door, its surface scarred and bleached by countless seasons. The key, large and ornate, turned in the lock with a protesting groan of rusted metal, the sound echoing unnaturally in the profound stillness. He pushed the door inward, and a blast of cold, stagnant air rushed out to meet him, carrying with it the dust of generations. The entrance hall was vast, cavernous, its vaulted ceiling lost in shadows. A grand staircase, its wood dark and richly carved, swept upwards into the gloom, a spectral pathway to unseen upper floors. Furniture, draped in ghostly white sheets, loomed like silent, waiting figures. The silence within was absolute, a heavy, pressing thing that seemed to absorb all sound, all life. It was not the peaceful quiet of an empty house, but the watchful, expectant silence of a place that remembered everything and had forgotten nothing. Adrian stepped inside, the door thudding shut behind him with a sound of grim finality. He was alone, utterly alone, in the heart of Blackwood Manor. The inheritance, he thought with a grim sense of foreboding, was far more than just stone and land. It was a legacy of shadows, of secrets best left undisturbed. And somewhere within these decaying walls, an object of singular, terrible beauty awaited its discovery, an artifact that would offer him the world, only to demand his soul in return. The air grew colder still, and from the depths of the house, he thought he heard a sound, faint and distant, like the sigh of an old man, or perhaps the rustle of paint on canvas. The story of the cursed painting was about to begin. Chapter 1. The Addict's Inheritance. The days that followed Adrian Thorne's arrival at Blackwood Manor bled into a monotonous cycle of exploration and deepening unease. Each room he entered was a mausoleum of forgotten lives, draped in cobwebs and the pervasive scent of decay. The sheer scale of the neglect was overwhelming. Peeling wallpaper hung in strips like sunburnt skin. Floorboards groaned underfoot with the sound of old bones settling, and a fine, gray dust, the accumulation of decades, lay thick upon every surface, muffling sound and casting a pallor over the once grand furnishings. He found himself speaking in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the slumber of whatever spirits might linger in the oppressive silence. His initial plan to quickly assess and sell the property was rapidly dissolving, replaced by a strange, almost morbid compulsion to uncover the history contained within these crumbling walls. He told himself it was academic curiosity, the instinct of a man who dealt in antiquarian texts, but a deeper, more primal part of him knew it was something else, a sense of being drawn, almost magnetically, toward the destiny that had lain dormant in this house, waiting for his arrival. The nights were the worst. The wind, sighing and moaning through ill-fitting window frames and down chimneys, sounded like mournful lamentations. Shadows danced in the periphery of his vision, cast by the flickering beam of his flashlight or the unsteady glow of the few functioning oil lamps he'd managed to find. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and plagued by disjointed images of the manor in its heyday, filled with people whose faces he couldn't quite see, their laughter echoing faintly before dissolving into the ever-present creaks and groans of the ancient structure. It was on the third day, while methodically working his way through the upper floors, that he found the locked door. It was unassuming, set at the end of a narrow, dark corridor in what seemed to be the oldest wing of the house, the wood stained and scarred. A heavy iron lock, its only adornment. Unlike the other doors, which had either been left ajar or yielded to a firm push, this one was steadfastly secured. His attempts to find a corresponding key amongst the jumble of rusted ironmongery he'd collected proved futile. A growing sense of intrigue, a feeling that this particular door guarded something significant, gnawed at him, The local agent had mentioned a handyman in the nearby village, a reclusive character named Silas, who occasionally did odd jobs at the manor for Alistair. Reluctantly, Adrian made the trip back to the village, the oppressive atmosphere of Blackwood clinging to him like a shroud. Silas, a man whose face looked as weathered and ancient as the manor itself, listened to Adrian's request with unsettlingly perceptive eyes. He agreed to come, but not without a cryptic warning. "Some doors best stay locked, Mr. Thorne. Some things best stay lost." The handyman arrived the next morning, his toolkit clanking like chains. He worked on the lock with a grim efficiency, his silence more unnerving than any conversation. Finally, with a rasping click, the mechanism yielded. Silas stepped back, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. "Attic," he grunted, his gaze flicking nervously towards the now-open doorway. "Never much cared for myself. Air's wrong up there." He refused payment for opening the door, merely nodding curtly before departing, leaving Adrian alone with the gaping darkness beyond the threshold. A blast of cold, stagnant air, far colder than the ambient temperature of the corridor, billowed out, carrying with it an intensified version of that faint, metallic scent he'd noticed upon first entering the manor, now mingled with the dry, papery aroma of ancient textiles and forgotten things. He hesitated, Silas's words echoing in his mind, a prickle of genuine fear surfacing. But the pull, that inexplicable sense of purpose, was stronger. He retrieved his most powerful flashlight and, taking a deep breath, stepped through the doorway and into the attic of Blackwood Manor. The space that greeted him was vast, stretching away into a gloom that his flashlight beam struggled to penetrate. The roof sloped sharply, supported by massive, rough-hewn beams from which hung thick shrouds of cobwebs, swaying gently in the drafts like spectral curtains. The floor was cluttered with the detritus of generations, broken furniture, stacks of water-stained books whose bindings had crumbled to dust, trunks with broken clasps spilling forth yellowed linens and moth-eaten garments, a child's rocking horse with one eye missing, staring blankly into the darkness. It was a chaotic graveyard of forgotten possessions, each item whispering of a life long since extinguished. The air was heavy, difficult to breathe, thick with the silence of ages. Adrian moved slowly, carefully, the crunch of his footsteps on the debris-strewn floorboards echoing unnaturally in the oppressive stillness. He felt like an intruder, a profaner of sacred, albeit decaying ground. He ran his light over a collection of tarnished silver trophies, a set of scientific instruments of brass and mahogany now green with verdigris, a dressmaker's dummy draped in the remnants of a silk gown that shimmered faintly, like captured moonlight. There was a profound sadness to it all, a sense of lives interrupted, of passions and ambitions reduced to mere dust and shadows. As he ventured deeper, towards the furthest, darkest corner of the attic, the cold intensified, a palpable chill that seeped into his bones. It was here, tucked away behind a towering stack of mildewed ledgers and a collapsed armoire, that he saw it, a large, rectangular shape draped entirely in a heavy, dust-laden linen sheet. It was set apart from the other clutter, almost as if deliberately concealed, yet also protected. Even through the thick covering, he sensed a peculiar stillness emanating from it, a focus point of the attic's pervasive cold. His heart began to pound, a mixture of trepidation and an almost feverish anticipation. This was it. This was what he had been drawn to. With hands that trembled slightly, he reached out and grasped the edge of the linen sheet. He hesitated for a moment, a final wave of Silas's warning washing over him, a sense of standing on the precipice of something significant, something potentially irreversible. Then, with a decisive pull, he drew the covering away. The dust motes, disturbed by his movement, swirled in the beam of his flashlight like a miniature galaxy before slowly settling. And there, revealed, was the portrait. It was nearly life-sized, encased in an ornate, if somewhat tarnished, gilt frame. It depicted a young man, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s, dressed in the fashionable attire of the early 19th century, a dark, high-collared coat, a meticulously tied cravat, his posture one of easy, aristocratic confidence. But it was the face that seized Adrian's attention, holding him utterly captive. The artistry was breathtaking, possessing a verisimilitude that was almost photographic, yet imbued with a depth and character that no mere photograph could capture. The unknown artist had rendered the subject's features with an almost unnerving precision. A strong jawline, a straight, noble nose, lips that hinted at both sensuality and a cruel amusement. His hair, a dark, rich brown, was swept back from a high forehead, a few errant locks falling with artful carelessness. But it was the eyes. The eyes were a masterpiece of unsettling brilliance. Dark, almost black, they stared directly out from the canvas, not at some indeterminate point in the distance, but at him. They were alive, glittering with an intelligence and intensity, and a hint of something else, a subtle, predatory awareness that seemed to penetrate Adrian's very core. He felt pinned by that painted gaze, scrutinized, assessed. A cold wave washed over him, more profound than the attic's ambient chill. What was truly astonishing, beyond the sheer artistic skill, was the painting's condition. While everything around it succumbed to decay, coated in grime and festooned with cobwebs, the surface of the portrait was immaculate. The colors were vibrant, jewel-like, the varnish seemingly uncracked, the canvas unblemished by time or neglect. It was as if it had been painted only yesterday, or perhaps as if it existed outside the normal flow of time altogether. Adrian found he couldn't look away. He felt a strange, powerful connection to the man in the portrait, an unsettling sense of recognition that he couldn't explain. It wasn't that he looked familiar in the conventional sense, but there was an aura about him, a certain indefinable quality in his gaze that resonated deep within Adrian, stirring dormant emotions, a mixture of fascination and a profound, instinctual dread. The silence of the attic pressed in, amplifying the sound of his own heartbeat. He reached out a hand, slowly, hesitantly, towards the painted surface, half expecting to feel the coolness of canvas, the texture of dried oil. His fingers hovered inches away, and he could almost swear he felt a faint, almost imperceptible warmth radiating from it. Or perhaps it was a coldness so intense it mimicked heat. He snatched his hand back. He stood there for a long time, mesmerized, the beam of his flashlight unwavering on the face of the painted man. The world outside the attic, the pragmatic concerns of inheritance and property disposal, all faded into insignificance. There was only this room, this silence, and this extraordinary, unnerving painting, against all rational judgment, against the insistent prickle of unease that raised the hairs on his arms. A decision formed in his mind, clear and resolute. He had to have it. He had to bring it down from this dusty mausoleum into the light, into his presence. The thought of leaving it here, alone in the cold and darkness, was suddenly unbearable. The eyes of the portrait seemed to hold his. A silent agreement passing, lowering the portrait from the attic proved to be a more arduous task than Adrian had anticipated. The frame, though appearing merely ornate, was surprisingly heavy, constructed from some dense, dark wood that felt cold to the touch, almost like stone. Navigating the narrow, treacherous attic stairs with the bulky canvas required all his strength and a precarious balancing act, each creaking step threatening to send him and his precious find tumbling into the gloom below. Dust, dislodged by his efforts, filled the air, making him cough and his eyes water, but he pressed on, driven by that inexplicable compulsion. He finally maneuvered it down into the main part of the house, leaning it temporarily against a wall in the grand, desolate entrance hall. Even there, amidst the shrouded furniture and faded grandeur, the portrait seemed to command the space, its vibrant colors and the piercing gaze of its subject a stark, living contrast to the surrounding decay. He spent the rest of the afternoon searching for a suitable place to hang it. Many of the rooms in Blackwood Manor were too damp, too dilapidated, or simply too vast and impersonal. He needed a space that felt right, a room where the painting could be appreciated, yet also, he admitted to himself with a shiver, contained. He eventually settled on the study, a moderately sized room on the ground floor, lined with empty bookshelves and featuring a large stone fireplace. It was gloomy, certainly with only one tall, mullioned window that admitted a grudging amount of gray light, but it possessed a certain faded dignity. More importantly, it felt somewhat insulated from the rest of the house's oppressive atmosphere. With considerable effort, he found a sturdy picture hook already embedded in the wall above the mantelpiece, as if awaiting this very purpose. Hoisting the portrait into place, he stepped back to observe his handiwork. The effect was immediate and profound. The portrait transformed the room. Its presence seemed to draw what little light there was towards it, the colors glowing with an inner luminescence. The young man on the canvas now surveyed the study with that same unnerving, proprietary air Adrian had first encountered in the attic. His dark eyes seemed to follow Adrian as he moved about the room, a trick of light and shadow, no doubt, but a disconcertingly effective one. Adrian found himself tidying the study with a newfound energy, dusting the bookshelves, clearing away cobwebs, as if preparing the room for an honored, if somewhat intimidating, guest. He even managed to coax a fire to life in the hearth, the flames casting dancing shadows that played across the portrait's features, giving them an illusion of subtle, flickering movement. He pulled up a worn leather armchair, positioning it so he could sit and observe the painting. As evening drew in, casting long, distorted shadows across the room, Adrian sat before the fire, a glass of his great uncle's forgotten brandy in hand, his gaze fixed on the canvas. The silence of Blackwood Manor still pressed in, but here, in the study, it felt different, charged with a new, focused energy. He found himself studying every detail of the painted figure, the almost imperceptible curl of the lip, the faint shadow beneath the high cheekbone, the intricate folds of the cravat. The artist, whoever he was, had been a master of his craft, capturing not just a likeness, but an essence, a personality that radiated from the canvas with an almost tangible force. Who was this man? What was his story? Why had his portrait been hidden away in the attic, preserved like a sacred relic, yet also, perhaps, like a dangerous secret? Questions swirled in Adrian's mind, but beneath them lay a simpler, more potent sensation, fascination. He felt a kinship with the painted man, a strange sense of understanding, as if they shared some unspoken secret, some common ground across the centuries that separated them. He raised his glass in a silent toast. "To you, whoever you are," he murmured, the words sounding loud in the stillness. The eyes in the portrait seemed to gleam in the firelight, a flicker of knowing amusement in their depths. Adrian felt a thrill, a frisson of something akin to excitement, mixed with a definite, undeniable undercurrent of dread. He was playing with something he didn't understand. He knew that on some level. Silas's warning echoed again. Some things best stay lost. But the allure of the painting, the pull of its silent, watchful presence, was too strong to resist. As the fire burned low and the shadows in the study deepened, Adrian Thorne, the pragmatic lecturer, felt a part of himself he thought long dormant begin to awaken, a part that was drawn to mystery, to beauty, and perhaps to the seductive whisper of the forbidden. He had inherited more than just a house. He had inherited a companion, a confidant, a silent, enigmatic observer whose secrets were yet to be unveiled. And as he finally drifted into an uneasy sleep in the armchair, the eyes of the portrait kept their vigil, unblinking in the darkness. Chapter 2, A Reflection of Vigor. Several weeks passed, and Adrian Thorne settled into an unusual, almost hermetic existence at Blackwood Manor. The initial intention to sort through his great uncle's affairs and prepare the property for sale had been indefinitely postponed, replaced by a quiet, introspective routine centered largely around the study, and its dominating occupant. He found a strange, almost monastic peace in the isolation. The silence of the ancient house, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the rustle of pages as he delved into the manor's neglected library, and the ever-present, subtle creaks and groans of the structure itself. He made occasional, perfunctory trips to the local village for supplies, enduring the curious or wary glances of the inhabitants with a newfound indifference. His world had contracted, focusing with an almost obsessive intensity on the enigmatic portrait that now formed the focal point of his days. He would spend hours in the leather armchair, sometimes reading, sometimes merely staring at the painted man, lost in contemplation. The portrait's gaze remained as potent as ever, a constant, silent scrutiny that Adrian no longer found entirely unnerving. Instead, it had become a familiar presence, almost a form of companionship. He talked to it, at first hesitantly, then with increasing ease, narrating his thoughts, his discoveries in the old books, his memories. The painted man, of course, offered no reply. Yet Adrian often felt a sense of being heard, of an intelligence behind those dark, unwavering eyes. He began to feel better, not just mentally, though the escape from his previous, somewhat monotonous life was certainly a factor, but physically. A persistent ache in his left knee, a souvenir from a youthful misadventure on a rugby field, which had plagued him for years, particularly in damp weather, simply vanished. One morning he woke up and realized he'd sprung out of bed without the usual cautionary stiffness, without that familiar, dull throb. He flexed his knee, astonished. It felt supple, strong, as it hadn't in over 2 decades. He attributed it to the country air, perhaps, or the increased physical activity involved in managing even a small part of the rambling house. He started noticing other, more subtle changes. The perpetual weariness that had been his constant companion for the last few years began to lift, replaced by a surprising surge of energy. He found himself sleeping more soundly, waking refreshed. He even caught himself humming as he went about his solitary chores, a lightness in his spirit that had been absent for too long. One afternoon, while attempting to clear a particularly stubborn tangle of ivy from the study window to allow more light, he caught his reflection in the grimy pane of glass. He paused, frowning. The gray at his temples, which had seemed to be advancing with alarming rapidity of late, looked less pronounced. The silver threads were still there, certainly, but they seemed finer, less stark against the darker hair. He leaned closer, peering at his reflection. Was it just a trick of the dim, uncertain light, or was there a subtle softening of the lines around his eyes? A new brightness in their depths? He dismissed it, a moment of wishful thinking, perhaps. Age, he knew, was in relentless tide, not given to such capricious retreats. Yet the thought lingered, a tiny, persistent seed of wonder. Later that day, he was in the study, stoking the fire, when his gaze fell upon the portrait. He stopped, the poker still in his hand. He stared intently at the painted face, a sudden, inexplicable unease stirring within him. Was it his imagination, or did the meticulously rendered hair of the young man on the canvas now possess a few, almost imperceptible, new threads of a lighter shade? A faint silvering at the temples that he was certain hadn't been there before. He stepped closer, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. The light in the study was notoriously poor, prone to casting deceptive shadows. He told himself it was a trick of the flickering firelight, an illusion created by his own obsessive scrutiny. But the image persisted, a faint, almost ghostly echo of his own receding gray, now appearing on the youthful head of the portrait. The following morning, the feeling of unreality deepened. Adrian was shaving, using an old-fashioned straight razor he'd found amongst his great uncle's effects, another small affectation of his new, anachronistic life. As he drew the blade across his cheek, he noticed it, a prominent wrinkle on his forehead, a deep furrow of concentration that had been a fixture for at least a decade, was fainter, undeniably, unmistakably, shallower than it had been the day before. He leaned into the mottled mirror, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it was significantly diminished, as if an unseen hand had gently smoothed it away. A thrill, cold and sharp, shot through him, immediately followed by a wave of profound disbelief. This was impossible. This was madness. He finished shaving in a daze, his mind racing, trying to find a rational explanation. Any explanation other than the utterly fantastical one that was beginning to form. Later that day, driven by a compulsion he couldn't resist, he returned to the study. He approached the portrait almost reluctantly, a sense of dread mingling with a strange, illicit excitement. He stood before it, his eyes scanning the painted face with a meticulous, almost forensic intensity. And there it was, a new line, faint but definite, etched into the smooth brow of the painted man, precisely where his own wrinkle had begun to fade. It was a delicate, almost invisible mark, the kind of subtle imperfection that might have been part of the original artistry, easily overlooked. But Adrian knew. He knew it hadn't been there yesterday. He stared, transfixed, a cold sweat breaking out on his palms. The room was silent, save for the frantic thumping of his own heart. The eyes of the portrait seemed to hold his, their dark depths unreadable, yet carrying a silent, knowing challenge. He backed away slowly, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence, a bizarre, inexplicable coincidence, where he was losing his mind, succumbing to the isolation and the oppressive atmosphere of Blackwood Manor. Yet, deep down, a terrifying, exhilarating suspicion began to take root, a suspicion that defied all logic, all reason, but resonated with an undeniable, instinctual truth. The portrait was changing, and as it changed, so did he. Wean them. A bargain struck in the forgotten corner of a decaying house. The subtle, almost imperceptible exchanges continued over the ensuing days, a silent, clandestine dialogue between Adrian and the canvas. Each morning brought a small, new marvel in his own reflection. A slight easing of the crow's feet around his eyes, a firmer tone to his jawline, a renewed luster in his hair that seemed to push back the encroaching silver. His energy levels soared. He felt a vigor he hadn't experienced since his early 30s, a lightness in his step, a clarity in his thoughts. He even found himself taking long, brisk walks through the neglected grounds of Blackwood, the damp autumn air feeling crisp and invigorating rather than chilling. The manor itself, though still decaying, seemed less oppressive, its shadows less menacing, as if his own burgeoning vitality was somehow pushing back against its melancholic aura. But with each small, personal victory against the relentless march of time, a corresponding mark appeared on the portrait. The faint silvering at the painted man's temples became more pronounced, a distinguished, yet undeniable, touch of gray. The skin on the canvas, once so flawlessly smooth, now bore the faintest suggestion of lines around the eyes, a subtle shadowing beneath the cheekbones that hinted at a loss of youthful plumpness. The changes were minute, painstakingly slow, like watching a flower fade in time-lapse photography. But to Adrian's increasingly obsessed gaze, they were as clear as day. He began to keep a secret journal, a small, leather-bound notebook he'd found in his great-uncle's desk, its pages brittle and yellowed. In it, he meticulously documented his own physical improvements, noting the date and the specific change, however small. On the opposing page, he would record, with equal precision, the subtle deteriorations he observed in the portrait. October 17th, one entry read, persistent ache in lower back, entirely gone. Able to lift the coal scuttle without a twinge. The subject in the portrait now displays a slight, almost imperceptible downturn at the corners of his mouth. A hint of weariness not previously present. Another, a few days later, October 22nd. Skin tone noticeably clearer, feels more elastic. Old shaving scar on chin, usually quite prominent, seems less visible. The portrait's eyes, while still intense, perhaps like a fraction of their former youthful brilliance. a faint shadow like a sleepless night beneath them. The act of recording these bizarre, twin transformations was both terrifying and strangely thrilling. It lent a semblance of scientific observation to a phenomenon that was utterly beyond the realm of science, a way of trying to rationalize the irrational. Yet, with each entry, the impossible truth became more firmly entrenched in his mind. There was a connection, a direct, undeniable link between his own rejuvenation and the portrait's subtle, creeping age. He was, in some inexplicable way, drawing youth, drawing vitality from the painted image, and the canvas, in turn, was absorbing his cast-off years, his discarded frailties. The implications were staggering, almost too immense to contemplate. Was it a curse? A blessing? Some bizarre, unknown natural law specific to this forgotten corner of the world, to this singular, enigmatic artifact? He oscillated between fear and a burgeoning, almost intoxicating sense of power. The fear was primal, a deep-seated unease about tampering with forces he didn't understand, about the unnaturalness of it all. What was the ultimate price for such a gift? Surely, time, once cheated, would exact its revenge in some unforeseen, terrible way. But the allure, the sheer, unadulterated seduction of renewed youth was a powerful opiate. To feel the aches and stiffness of middle age receding, to see his own reflection growing younger, more vibrant, day by day, it was a potent temptation, a siren song that drowned out the whispers of caution. He found himself spending even more time in the study, drawn by an irresistible magnetism. He would sit for hours, simply gazing at the portrait, a silent communion passing between them. He no longer spoke to it aloud. The exchange felt too intimate, too profound for mere words. He would sometimes trace the lines of his own face in a mirror, then turn to the portrait and imagine those same lines, those same marks of age, transferring themselves onto the canvas. And sometimes, he could almost swear he saw it happen. A flicker, a subtle shift in the painted surface, as if the oils themselves were alive, malleable, responding to his silent will. A small, nagging cough that had troubled him for weeks, a persistent, dry irritation he'd attributed to the dust and damp of the manor, vanished overnight. He woke one morning, took a deep breath, and realized his lungs felt clearer, stronger than they had in months. He felt an almost boyish urge to run, to shout, to test the limits of this newfound vigor. That same afternoon, as he stood before the portrait, he noticed it, a subtle, almost shadowy deepening around the painted man's mouth, a faint, almost imperceptible etching of lines that spoke of strain, of a life beginning to wear on him. The eyes, too, seemed to have lost another fraction of their light, a subtle weariness creeping into their dark depths. Adrian felt a pang, not of guilt, not yet, but of something akin to a detached, clinical pity. He was siphoning life from this silent, unknowable entity, this man trapped in oils and varnish. Yet the sensation was fleeting, quickly overshadowed by the sheer, exhilarating reality of his own transformation. He was cheating time. He was undoing the damage of years. The secret journal became his confidant, his co-conspirator. The meticulous cataloging of changes, both in himself and in the painting, became a ritual, a necessary observance in this strange, gilded bargain he had unwittingly struck. The fear hadn't entirely disappeared, but had been pushed to the periphery, overshadowed by the intoxicating bloom of stolen youth. The portrait was his secret, his miracle, his dark, beautiful addiction. And with every day that passed, with every line that faded from his own face only to reappear on the canvas, the pact, unspoken and unacknowledged, grew stronger, binding him ever more tightly to the enigmatic man whose life he was slowly, inexorably consuming. The initial allure was solidifying into a conscious, if still unadmitted, acceptance of the impossible. Chapter 3, The Gilded Bargain. The rejuvenation was no longer a matter of subtle shifts or wishful thinking. It was an undeniable, striking reality. Adrian Thorne, who had arrived at Blackwood Manor, a man visibly succumbing to the erosions of middle age, now possessed the appearance and vitality of someone good 10, perhaps even 15 years younger. His hair, once heavily threaded with gray, had regained much of its former dark richness, with only a distinguished hint of silver remaining at the temples, more a mark of character than of age. His skin was smoother, firmer, the lines that had etched his face softened, some erased entirely. He moved with a new ease, an athletic grace he hadn't known since his 20s. His energy was boundless. He found himself sleeping less, yet feeling more rested, more alert. The world seemed sharper, more vibrant, as if a dull film had been lifted from his senses. Had he possessed any regular acquaintances or a circle of friends, his transformation would have been the subject of astonishment, perhaps even suspicion. But in the profound isolation of Blackwood Manor, his only constant companion was the silent, watchful portrait in the study. And the only witness to his miraculous rewind of time was his own increasingly youthful reflection in the antique mirrors of the house. He still attempted to rationalize it, to offer himself mundane explanations for the impossible. The clean country air, he would tell himself, the simple, stress-free life, a healthier diet, even though his eating habits had changed little. But these were feeble justifications, pale attempts to overlay a veneer of normalcy onto a phenomenon that was anything but. Deep down, he knew the truth. He knew the source of this stolen vitality. It resided in the darkening gaze and the increasingly careworn features of the man on the canvas. The portrait, in stark contrast to Adrian's burgeoning youthfulness, now bore the undeniable marks of advancing years. The subject, once depicted in the prime of his late 20s, now appeared to be a man firmly entrenched in his late 40s, perhaps even touching 50. The silver at his temples was no longer a mere suggestion, but a definite, pronounced reality. Lines, fine yet distinct, webbed the corners of his eyes and etched themselves around his mouth. There was a subtle sag to the jawline, a hint of weariness in the set of his shoulders, a dimming of the once fiery intensity in his eyes. It was as if the portrait was a living entity, a temporal sponge, absorbing the age that Adrian shed, becoming a repository for his discarded years. The first genuine fear, a cold, sharp stab of it, began to surface in Adrian's consciousness, cutting through the intoxicating haze of his rejuvenation. What was the nature of this exchange? It was one thing to feel younger, more alive, but it was another entirely to witness day by day the visible aging of another being, even a painted one. Was this a benign, if inexplicable, phenomenon, a mere curiosity of the natural world? Or was it something darker, something with hidden costs and unforeseen consequences? The silence of the portrait offered no answers, its painted eyes holding their secrets close. Yet, even as this nascent fear began to prick at him, the sheer, undeniable benefit of the bargain was too potent, too seductive to ignore. He felt better than he had in decades. He felt alive, truly alive, as if he had been given a second chance, a reprieve from the inevitable decline. The nagging anxieties about his health, his future, his mortality, which had been his constant companions, had receded, replaced by a heady sense of optimism, of boundless possibility. He found himself almost unconsciously encouraging the process. He spent more and more time in the study, positioning his armchair so that he faced the portrait directly, basking in its presence as one might bask in the sun. He would read aloud to it, sharing passages from the ancient tomes he discovered in the manor's library, feeling a strange sense of communion with the silent, aging figure on the canvas. He took to grooming himself before the portrait, as if seeking its approval, its silent acknowledgement of his renewed youth. It was a bizarre, almost ritualistic behavior, and a part of him, the rational, academic part, recoiled from it, recognizing its inherent madness. But another, more powerful, more primal part of him embraced it, reveled in it. He felt a sense of power, a thrilling, illicit control over the forces of time and decay. He was not merely a passive recipient of this strange gift. He was an active participant, a willing partner in this gilded bargain. The portrait, in turn, seemed to respond to his increased attention, its aging process perhaps even accelerating subtly. The lines on the painted face deepened almost imperceptibly after a particularly long evening spent in its company. The vitality that flowed into Adrian felt stronger, more potent. The unease, the faint whisper of fear was still there, a dissonant note in the symphony of his rejuvenation, but it was increasingly easy to ignore, to push to the back of his mind. The immediate, tangible benefits were too overwhelming, too intoxicating. He was young again, or at least rapidly heading in that direction. And for now, that was all that mattered. The gilded bargain, though unspoken, unwritten, and utterly inexplicable, felt sealed. The price, whatever it might be, was a concern for a future that, for Adrian Thorne, seemed to be stretching out before him, brighter and longer than he had ever dared to hope. The shadowed halls of Blackwood Manor, once a symbol of decay and forgotten pasts, now felt like a sanctuary, a secret crucible where time itself was being reforged to his will. Chapter 4. Whispers from the Canvas. The nights at Blackwood Manor, once merely long and silent, began to take on a new, unsettling dimension. Adrian's sleep, though generally deep and refreshing in a way it hadn't been for years, became a canvas for intensely vivid, almost hallucinatory dreams. These were not the usual fragmented, nonsensical narratives of the subconscious. They were coherent, detailed, and possessed an unnerving sense of historical authenticity. He dreamt of candlelit ballrooms, the air thick with perfume and the murmur of clandestine conversations, women in elaborate silk gowns with powdered hair, men in neat breeches and buckled shoes, their faces animated in the flickering light. He dreamt of clattering carriage wheels on cobbled streets, the misty glow of gas lamps illuminating shadowy alleyways, the urgent cry of a night watchman. He found himself an observer in these nocturnal dramas, sometimes a participant, though his role was always unclear, his own identity shifting and amorphous. The central figure in these dreams, however, was often, disturbingly, the man from the portrait, but not the aging figure that now graced the canvas in his study. In his dreams, the man was young again, vibrant, radiating the same magnetic charm and intense vitality that Adrian had first seen in the attic. He saw him dueling at dawn in a misty field, the flash of steel glinting in the pale light. He saw him in passionate clandestine embraces in shadowed alcoves, his dark eyes burning with a fierce possessiveness. He saw him in smoke-filled, gambling dens, a cynical smile playing on his lips as he raked in piles of gold, and in quiet, paneled libraries, his brow furrowed in concentration over ancient, leather-bound tomes. These weren't just images. They were imbued with emotions, passion, danger, triumph, despair, that felt startlingly real. Adrian would wake with a jolt, his heart pounding, the scent of old velvet or the metallic tang of drawn steel still lingering in his nostrils. He would lie in the darkness of his bedroom, disoriented, the boundary between dream and reality blurred, feeling as though he had just returned from a journey to another century, as though he had inhabited another man's memories, another man's life. The experiences were unsettling, leaving a residue of unease that clung to him throughout the day. The waking world, too, began to feel subtly altered by the painting's influence. The presence of the portrait in the study grew more pronounced, more sentient. It was no longer just a piece of art, however masterfully executed. It felt like a silent, watchful entity. Adrian would be reading in his armchair, his back to the mantelpiece, and an unshakable feeling of being observed would creep over him, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. He would turn, quickly, half expecting to find someone, something, standing behind him, But there was only the portrait, its painted eyes fixed on him with that unwavering, knowing intensity. Sometimes, from the corner of his eye, as he moved about the room, he would catch a flicker of movement from the canvas, a subtle shift in the painted man's gaze, as if his eyes were following Adrian's progress. A momentary, almost imperceptible, deepening of the shadows around the mouth, suggesting the ghost of a smile, or perhaps a sneer. He would stare directly at the portrait, trying to catch in the act, but the image would always be perfectly still, inanimate, its features fixed in their painted expression of weary dignity. He tried to dismiss these sensations as products of his isolation, of an overactive imagination fueled by the strange circumstances and the Gothic atmosphere of Blackwood Manor. He was, after all, spending an inordinate amount of time alone, with only his thoughts and the silent, aging visage on the canvas for company. It was natural, perhaps, that his mind would begin to play tricks on him. Yet, the feeling persisted, growing stronger, more difficult to ignore. The air in the study often felt charged, almost electric, especially in the evenings, when the firelight cast dancing shadows and the rest of the house was plunged into a profound, unnerving stillness. He would find himself speaking to the portrait less, a new caution tempering his earlier familiarity. The sense of companionship was still there, but it was now overlaid with a thin veneer of apprehension. It was one thing to believe the painting was siphoning his age, a bizarre, but in its own way, passive exchange. It was another thing entirely to suspect it was aware that it was watching him, perhaps even judging him. One late afternoon, as dusk was beginning to creep into the corners of the study, Adrian was attempting to light a stubborn oil lamp. His back was to the portrait. He fumbled with the wick, muttering under his breath in frustration. Suddenly, he heard it, or thought he heard it, a sound so faint, so fleeting it was almost subliminal. A sigh, a soft, drawn-out exhalation, like someone weary beyond measure. It seemed to come from the direction of the mantelpiece. Adrian froze, his blood running cold. He strained his ears, holding his breath, but there was only the oppressive silence of the room, the distant moan of the wind outside. He told himself it was the house settling, a draft in the chimney. Anything but what he instinctively feared it to be. Yet the sound had been so distinct, so human. He slowly turned, his gaze drawn inexorably to the portrait. The painted face stared back at him, its expression unchanged, its lips sealed. But the eyes, was it his imagination, or did they hold a new depth of sorrow, a profound, ancient weariness that went beyond the mere depiction of physical aging? He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The whispers from the canvas, whether real or imagined, were beginning. The line between the observer and the observed was blurring. The portrait was no longer just a reflection of his fading age. It was becoming an active, unsettling presence in his life, its silent influence seeping into his dreams, into his waking thoughts, into the very air he breathed. The gilded bargain was beginning to reveal a more complex, and perhaps more sinister, set of terms. Chapter 5. The Bloom of Stolen Time. The insidious creep of winter settled over Blackwood Manor, bringing with it shorter days, longer nights, an abiding chill that even the roaring fires in the study hearth struggled to entirely dispel. Adrian, however, felt largely impervious to the season's gloom. His rejuvenation had continued, unabated, and he now possessed the physical appearance of a man in his early, vigorous 30s. His energy was boundless, his mind sharp and alert. The aches and pains of middle age were a distant memory, replaced by a sense of robust health and an almost boyish vitality. He found himself tackling chores around the rambling estate that he would never have contemplated just a few months prior. Clearing overgrown pathways, repairing a section of collapsed stone wall, even attempting to bring some order to the wild, untamed gardens. He worked with a tireless enthusiasm, reveling in the newfound strength and stamina that coursed through his veins. The portrait, in stark contrast, had aged dramatically. The man on the canvas now looked to be well into his 60s, perhaps even touching 70. His once dark hair was almost entirely white, thin and wispy. The skin, once smooth and youthful, was now deeply lined, papery and drawn tight over prominent cheekbones. The eyes, though still retaining a spark of their former intensity, were sunken, shadowed, and held a look of profound, weary suffering. The transformation was shocking, a stark and unsettling testament to the unnatural exchange taking place. Each day, Adrian would observe the painting, a strange mixture of triumph and a nascent, quickly suppressed guilt churning within him. He was living, truly living, while this painted effigy withered and decayed before his very eyes. It was during a particularly harsh cold snap, when the wind howled around the eaves of Blackwood like a banshee and frost painted feathery patterns on the inside of the window panes, that Adrian fell ill. It began with a scratchiness in his throat, a slight heaviness in his limbs. He initially dismissed it as a minor chill, nothing that his revitalized constitution couldn't handle. But within 24 hours, he was gripped by a raging fever. Chills racked his body, alternating with periods of intense, burning heat. His head throbbed, his muscles ached, and a hacking cough tore at his chest. He lay in his bed, weak and disoriented, the vibrant health he had so recently reclaimed seemingly deserting him with alarming speed. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the haze of his illness. Was this it? Was this the price? Was the stolen youth being reclaimed, the bargain defaulting? He thought of the portrait, of its increasingly aged and frail appearance. If he succumbed, what would happen to it? Would it revert to its original youthful state, its purpose fulfilled? Or would it simply crumble to dust, its stolen life force extinguished along with his own? The thought of losing his newfound vitality, of sliding back into the frailties of age, or worse, was unbearable. With a monumental effort, fueled by a desperate, primal fear, he dragged himself from his bed. Shivering uncontrollably, wrapped in a heavy dressing gown, he stumbled his way through the cold, echoing corridors of the manor, his destination the study. He had to see the painting. He had to be near it. He collapsed into the leather armchair before the hearth, his teeth chattering, his body trembling. He was too weak even to light a fire. His fever gaze fixed on the portrait. In the dim, gray light of the winter afternoon, the painted man looked ancient, skeletal, his eyes holding a chillingly vacant stare. Adrian stared at it, a silent, desperate plea forming in his mind. He didn't know what he was asking for, what he expected, but he felt, with a certainty that transcended logic, that his only hope lay with this silent, enigmatic canvas. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his awareness punctuated by fits of coughing and the agonizing ache in his limbs. Hours passed. The room grew darker, colder. At some point, he must have lost consciousness completely. When he awoke, it was to a profound stillness. The shivering had stopped. The burning heat of the fever had subsided, replaced by a gentle warmth. His head was clear, the throbbing gone. He sat up, slowly, cautiously. He felt well, not just recovered, but remarkably, impossibly well. He touched his forehead. It was cool. He took a deep breath. His lungs felt clear, his chest free of the earlier constriction. He flexed his limbs. The aching was gone. He felt not only healed, but infused with a surge of energy, a vibrant, almost electric vitality that pulsed through him. He got his feet, steady and strong. It was a miracle, a complete, inexplicable recovery, accomplished in a matter of hours, from an illness that should have laid him low for days, if not weeks. A wave of euphoria washed over him, quickly followed by a dawning, horrified realization. He turned, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and a terrible, illicit triumph, towards the portrait. The transformation was beyond shocking. It was grotesque. The man on the canvas was no longer merely old. He was ancient, a horrifying memento mori. The figure was emaciated, the skin stretched like parchment over a skull, tinged with a ghastly, corpse-like pallor. The white hair was sparse, clinging to the scalp in pathetic wisps. The eyes were deeply sunken, almost lost in their sockets, yet they still burned with a faint, terrible light, a spark of trapped, tormented consciousness. The lips were drawn back from the teeth in a silent, lipless rictus, a frozen grimace of unimaginable suffering and decay. It was the face of death, of time carried to its most hideous extreme. Adrian stared, his blood running cold, his earlier euphoria evaporating like mist. The cost of his miraculous recovery was starkly, horrifyingly displayed before him. He had not just stolen years. He had stolen life itself, draining the very essence from the painted figure, leaving behind this desiccated, near-skeletal husk. The sheer extent of the change, the direct, brutal correlation between his own dramatic resurgence and the portrait's accelerated decay, was profoundly disturbing. It was no longer a subtle exchange, a gentle rebalancing of time. This was a violent, parasitic act. He had fed on the portrait, consumed its remaining vitality to fuel his own. A wave of nausea washed over him. For the first time, the full, monstrous weight of the bargain pressed down on him. Yet, even as horror warred with revulsion, another, darker emotion stirred within him. A fierce, possessive exultation. He was alive. He was young. He had cheated death itself. He ran a hand over his own smooth, unlined face, felt the strong, steady beat of his heart, the surge of vibrant energy that coursed through his veins. The contrast between his own youthful vigor and the horrifying decay on the canvas was a testament to his power, to the incredible, terrible gift he possessed. The painting was a sacrifice, a necessary one for his own continued existence, his own perpetual youth. The momentary guilt, the flicker of horror, was ruthlessly suppressed. The desire for life, for youth, for this stolen bloom of time, was too strong, too deeply ingrained. He had made his choice, or rather, the choice had been made for him, and he had embraced it. He turned away from the horrifying visage on the canvas, a new, steely resolve hardening within him. The price was high, yes, but the reward was life itself. And he could not, relinquish it. Chapter 6, Shadows in the Glass. The dramatic rejuvenation, coupled with his miraculous recovery from the severe illness, solidified Adrian's transformation. He now appeared, by any objective measure, to be a man in his late 20s, possessing a vitality and physical perfection that perhaps even surpassed his natural youth. His features had refined, taking on an almost classical beauty. His eyes shone with an unnatural clarity, and his body was lean, strong, and tireless. But this physical zenith came at a steep and increasingly visible psychological cost. Paranoia, once a fleeting, nagging suspicion, now took root, its tendrils wrapping tightly around his thoughts, coloring his perceptions. The secret of the portrait of his stolen youth became an all-consuming obsession. He lived in constant fear of discovery, of anyone witnessing his unnatural state and asking questions he couldn't answer. Blackwood Manor, once merely isolated, became his fortress, his prison. He ventured out only when absolutely necessary for essential supplies, and these trips to the nearest village became exercises in nerve-wracking tension. He took to wearing hats pulled low, scarves wrapped high, avoiding eye contact, his interactions clipped and hurried. The locals, who had initially regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and the usual rural suspicion of outsiders, now openly stared. Their whispers, he imagined, followed him down the narrow streets. Looks younger every time I see him. He'd overhear, or thought he overheard. It ain't natural. Their scrutiny felt like physical blows, reinforcing his desperate need for secrecy, for isolation. He spent hours examining his reflection, not with the simple vanity of youth, but with a kind of anxious, almost fearful scrutiny. He would trace the lines of his face, or rather, the lack of them, marveling at the smoothness of his skin, the vibrant color of his hair. But sometimes, in the depths of his own eyes, he would see a flicker of something cold, something watchful, a subtle hardness that hadn't been there before. It was a faint echo of the original intensity he'd seen in the portrait's eyes when he first discovered it in the attic. A hint of the predatory awareness that had so unsettled him. It was as if, along with the stolen youth, he was also absorbing some subtle aspect of the painted man's original nature, a chilling, alien quality that was slowly overlaying his own personality. His connection to the world outside Blackwood Manor withered. Letters from former colleagues went unanswered. The distant drone of the modern world, with its demands and expectations, felt utterly irrelevant to his current existence. His reality had contracted to the decaying grandeur of the house and the increasingly horrifying, yet utterly essential, artifact in the study. The portrait itself was now a truly grotesque spectacle. It no longer depicted an aged man, but something barely human, a skeletal figure draped in papery, desiccated skin, its eye sockets dark, cavernous pools from which an unholy light still seemed to flicker. The rictus on its lips had become more pronounced, a silent, eternal scream of torment. Adrian could barely stand to look at it. The sight of it filled him with a profound revulsion, a visceral horror that churned his stomach. Yet, he was drawn to it, compelled to check its state each day, to reassure himself that the terrible exchange was still in effect, that his youth was secure. It was a ghastly ritual, a daily confrontation with the monstrous price of his vitality. He began to talk to himself more, his voice echoing unnaturally in the empty rooms of the manor. Sometimes he would address the portrait, not in the earlier conversational tones, but with a kind of bitter, resentful intimacy, as if speaking to a loathsome but indispensable accomplice. "Look at you," he would sneer, his own youthful face contorted with a strange mixture of disgust and triumph. Withered, empty, while I grow stronger. But there was a hollowness to his bravado, a gnawing emptiness that the stolen youth couldn't fill. He felt increasingly detached, not just from the outside world, but from himself, from the man he once was. The memories of his former life, his academic career, his mundane worries seemed to belong to someone else, someone distant and almost forgotten. His focus had narrowed to a single burning point, the preservation of his youth, the maintenance of the hideous bargain. Any fleeting thoughts of trying to understand the portrait's origins or of seeking a way to break the curse were ruthlessly suppressed. The fear of losing what he had gained, of reverting to his former state, or worse, of suffering the accelerated decay he witnessed on the canvas, was too powerful. He was trapped, a prisoner of his own impossible vitality, bound to the decaying effigy in the study. One afternoon, driven by a rare and pressing need for some specific supplies he couldn't obtain in the local village, Adrian made the longer journey to the county town. It was his first significant interaction with a larger, more anonymous population in many months. As he walked through the bustling streets, he was acutely aware of the glances he drew. He was, by any standard, a remarkably handsome young man, and his appearance naturally attracted attention. But the attention felt different now. It was sharper, more inquisitive, sometimes laced with an open, almost covetous admiration that made his skin crawl. In a chemist's shop, while waiting to be served, he overheard two women whispering behind him. "My word, look at him," one said, her voice a hushed stage whisper. "He's like something out of a dream. I wonder what his secret is." Adrian froze, his back to them, his hand clenching into a fist. "Secret." The words seemed to clang in the air like an alarm bell. He paid for his items quickly, his face flushed, and hurried out of the shop, convinced that everyone was staring, everyone was speculating. Later, as he was leaving the town, he caught sight of an old acquaintance from his university days, a man he hadn't seen in nearly 20 years. The man, now stout and balding, with the unmistakable paunch of middle age, did a double take as Adrian passed, his eyes widening in disbelief. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then hesitated, a look of profound confusion, almost fear on his face. Adrian didn't stop, didn't acknowledge him. He walked on, his heart hammering, the encounter leaving him shaken and deeply unnerved. The world outside Blackwood was a minefield of potential discovery, of dangerous questions. He retreated back to the oppressive safety of the manor with a profound sense of relief. The heavy oak door thudding shut behind him like the closing of a tomb. The shadows in the glass, both in the antique mirrors of the house and in the depths of his own eyes, were growing longer, darker, more defined. He was young, beautiful, and utterly, terrifyingly alone with his monstrous secret. Chapter 7. The Crimson Thread. The rhythm of the exchange, the silent draining of age from Adrian and its bestowal upon the portrait, had become a ghastly norm. But as the last vestiges of anything recognizably human faded from the canvas, leaving only a skeletal, near-demonic caricature of extreme decrepitude, the nature of the price began to shift, subtly at first, then with a chilling, undeniable directness. It was no longer enough for the painting merely to absorb the abstract concept of Adrian's discarded years. It seemed to hunger for something more tangible, something more personal. After a particularly potent surge of youthfulness, Adrian woke one morning feeling not just young, but imbued with an almost supernatural clarity of thought, a sharpness of senses that bordered on the uncanny. As if he could hear the very heartbeat of the ancient house, he experienced a peculiar and unsettling lacuna in his memory. He was trying to recall a specific, cherished moment from his childhood. A summer afternoon spent fishing with his grandfather, the warmth of the sun on his face, the particular shade of blue of the kingfisher that had darted past. It was a memory he had often revisited, a small, perfect jewel of happiness. Now it was simply gone. He could remember the fact of having gone fishing with his grandfather, but the sensory details, the emotional resonance, the very essence of the memory, had been erased, leaving a cold, blank void where warmth and joy had once resided. He struggled to retrieve it, a growing panic rising in his chest. It was like grasping at smoke. The memory and the piece of his past it represented had been excised as cleanly as if by a surgeon's scalpel. He tried to dismiss it as a trick of the mind, a consequence of his isolation or the unnatural life he was leading. But a few weeks later, after another similar surge of heightened vitality, a feeling of being almost electrically alive, his thoughts racing with brilliant, incisive clarity, another piece of his past vanished. This time, it was the memory of his first love, the face of the girl, the sound of her laughter, the awkward sweetness of their youthful romance. All gone, replaced by a sterile, factual knowledge that such an event had occurred, but devoid of any emotional content, any personal connection. It was as if parts of his soul, the very threads that wove the tapestry of his identity, were being systematically unraveled, offered up as payment for his unnatural youth. A cold dread began to seep into Adrian, a fear far more profound than the simple fear of discovery. He was not just cheating time. He was sacrificing his own history, his own humanity, piece by piece. The youth he possessed felt increasingly hollow, a beautiful, empty facade behind which the essential Adrian Thorne was slowly being eroded. The portrait, now a nightmarish tableau of decay that seemed to writhe with a malevolent, inner light, offered no solace, only a silent, hungry demand. Its eyes, those sunken and barely visible within their cavernous sockets, seemed to burn with a new, predatory intelligence, as if it savored these more intimate, more personal sacrifices. Then, the price escalated beyond the intangible. Adrian had, in his solitude, found a sliver of companionship in a stray cat that had begun to frequent the overgrown gardens of Blackwood Manor. It was a scrawny, battle-scarred Ginger Tom, wary at first, but gradually won over by Adrian's offerings of food and quiet, non-threatening presence. He had named it Cinder, for its habit of appearing from the shadowy undergrowth like an ember from a dying fire. Cinder had become a small, warm point of normalcy in Adrian's increasingly bizarre existence. Its purrs a comforting sound in the oppressive silence of the house. Its rough affection a welcome contrast to the cold, watchful presence of the portrait. One morning, after a night in which Adrian had felt a particularly powerful wave of rejuvenation, a sense of almost electric invigoration that left him feeling as if he could conquer the world, he went to find Cinder. He searched the gardens, calling its name, but there was no response. A growing sense of unease prickled at him. He finally found the cat near the crumbling wall of the old kitchen garden. Cinder was dead, but it wasn't the peaceful death of an old animal, nor the violent end of a fight or accident. The cat's body was withered. Its fur was dull and clumped, its small frame emaciated, as if it had starved for weeks, though Adrian had fed it only the previous evening. Its eyes were sunken, its limbs unnaturally stiff and contorted. It looked, in a horrifyingly miniature way, like the skeletal figure in the portrait. A wave of icy horror washed over Adrian, so profound it left him breathless. He stared at the small, desiccated corpse, and he knew with a sickening certainty that Cinder's life, its small, warm spark, had been extinguished to fuel his own unnatural vitality. The painting was no longer content with merely absorbing his discarded age or even his memories. It was now drawing life from the world around him, taking it, consuming it, to sustain the dark miracle of his youth. The death of Cinder was a turning point. The abstract horror of the situation became chillingly, undeniably concrete. He was a parasite, a monster, his stolen youth paid for not just by the decay of a painted image, but by the actual, tangible destruction of life. Guilt, raw and corrosive, gnawed at him, a sensation he hadn't truly felt since the early days of his transformation. He buried Cinder beneath an old, gnarled apple tree, his hands trembling, his heart heavy with a grief that was as much for the cat as it was for his own lost innocence, his own corrupted soul. He avoided the study for days, unable to face the portrait, unable to bear the sight of its leering, skeletal triumph. But the pull was too strong, the addiction too deeply ingrained. He needed the vitality it offered, the youth that had become his defining characteristic, his very reason for being. He returned to the study, a man defeated, a slave to the monstrous bargain he had embraced. The crimson thread of sacrifice had been drawn, and Adrian knew, with a cold, dawning terror, that the portrait's hunger was far from sated. It would demand more. It would always demand more. And he, in his gilded cage of eternal youth, would be forced to provide. Chapter 8. The Unseen Toll. Adrian Thorne's physical transformation was, by all external measures, complete and utterly astonishing. He inhabited the body of a man in his absolute prime, perhaps even an idealized version of it, possessing a striking, almost ageless beauty that could turn heads and inspire envy. His eyes, a clear, piercing shade that seemed to draw light, held an unnerving intensity. His movements were fluid, graceful, imbued with a boundless energy that never seemed to wane. He was a living statue, a perfect specimen of youthful manhood. But this flawless exterior masked a profound and accelerating internal decay. The unseen toll of the portrait's curse was exacting a devastating price on his personality, his very essence. The warmth, the intellectual curiosity, the gentle melancholy that had once defined Adrian Thorne were being systematically eroded, replaced by a chillingly cold detachment. His capacity for empathy, already diminished, now seemed almost entirely extinguished. The death of Cinder, which had initially plunged him into a vortex of guilt and grief, now registered as a distant, almost abstract regret. A necessary, if unfortunate, expenditure in the ongoing maintenance of his own vitality. He had become increasingly narcissistic, his thoughts revolving almost exclusively around his physical appearance and the preservation of his unnatural youth. He would spend hours before the antique mirrors of Blackwood Manor, not in admiration, but in a kind of anxious, obsessive cataloging of his features, alert for the slightest hint of any returning imperfection, any sign that the portrait's power might be waning. His intellect, once sharp and engaged with the world of literature and history, now focused with a laser-like intensity on the singular problem of his own existence. The books in the manor's vast library, which he had once explored with such enthusiasm, now gathered fresh layers of dust. His only reading material, if it could be called that, was the silent, horrifying narrative playing out on the canvas in the study. The portrait itself had transcended mere grotesquerie. It was a memento mori of unimaginable horror. The skeletal figure was now so desiccated, so stripped of any semblance of flesh or humanity, that it resembled an ancient lich, a creature dragged from the deepest, darkest recesses of a nightmare. Its bones, yellowed and brittle-looking, were stark against the dark, oppressive background of the painting. The eye sockets were vast, empty pits, yet from their depths, a faint, infernal light still seemed to glow, a spark of undying, malevolent consciousness. The rictus on its lipless mouth was a silent scream of eternal torment, or perhaps a leer of triumph. Adrian avoided the study whenever possible, the sight of the painting filling him with a visceral revulsion that was almost physically painful. Yet, he could not escape its influence. It was a constant, oppressive presence in the house, its psychic weight pressing down on him, a constant reminder of the monstrous bargain he had struck, the damnation he had embraced. He felt tethered to it, an invisible cord of shared, perverted life force binding him to the hideous thing on the canvas. The stolen youth, once a source of intoxicating joy, now felt like a gilded cage, its bars forged from his own fear and the portrait's insatiable hunger. His isolation was absolute. He no longer dared to venture even into the local village. The fear of discovery, of someone noticing the impossible stasis of his youth, or worse, the subtle, chilling changes in his demeanor, was too great. Blackwood Manor had become his world, its decaying walls the boundaries of his existence. The silence of the house, once broken by his own hesitant attempts at conversation with the portrait or the comforting presence of Cinder, was now complete, a heavy, suffocating blanket that mirrored the emptiness growing within him. He moved through the grand, desolate rooms like a ghost, his perfect, youthful form a jarring contrast to the surrounding decay. He was a beautiful anomaly, a vibrant splash of life in a dying house. Yet he himself was dying on the inside, his soul withering even as his body flourished. The unseen toll was far greater than the mere sacrifice of memories or the lives of small animals. It was the erosion of his humanity, the slow, inexorable transformation into something cold, something predatory, something that reflected the monstrous entity trapped within the portrait. He was becoming what he fed upon. The horror of this realization sometimes broke through his carefully constructed apathy, a fleeting moment of clarity that brought with it a wave of sickening despair. But these moments were increasingly rare, quickly suppressed by the overriding imperative to survive, to maintain the unnatural stasis he had achieved. The price was his soul, he knew that now. But it was a price he was, by some terrible, ingrained instinct, still willing to pay. The portrait, in its silent, skeletal horror, was not just a source of his stolen youth. It was becoming a mirror, reflecting the monstrous truth of what Adrian Thorne was becoming. Chapter 9. Seeking the Unspeakable. The fragile equilibrium of Adrian's monstrous existence, a delicate balance between his stolen youth and the portrait's insatiable hunger, was shattered by a new, terrifying development. He began to feel flickers, moments when the vibrant energy that coursed through him would suddenly dim, like a lamp sputtering before going out. A sudden, debilitating wave of fatigue would wash over him, leaving him breathless and weak. He would catch his reflection and see, for a fleeting, horrifying instant, a faint shadow under his eyes, a momentary dullness in his skin, as if the illusion of youth was threatening to unravel. These episodes were brief, lasting only a few moments, but they filled him with a cold, visceral terror. Was the portrait's power waning? Or was its hunger growing so immense that the passive absorption of life force was no longer sufficient? The thought that his youth was not permanent, that it could be reclaimed, that he could revert to his former state, or worse, suffer the accelerated, horrifying decay he witnessed on the canvas, was a prospect too dreadful to contemplate. Fear, a raw, primal fear he hadn't experienced since the early days of his transformation, finally managed to pierce through the layers of his carefully constructed apathy and cold detachment. Vanity, once a driving force, was now eclipsed by a desperate, clawing need for self-preservation. He had to understand. He had to know the nature of the curse he was bound to, the history of the malevolent entity that resided within the oils and varnish. For the first time in a long while, a spark of his former intellectual curiosity, albeit twisted and warped by his current predicament, was rekindled. He was no longer content to be a passive recipient of the portrait's dark gift. He needed to gain some measure of control, some understanding if he was to survive. Driven by this new, desperate urgency, Adrian plunged into the dusty, neglected library of Blackwood Manor. The room, which he had largely ignored for months, now became the center of his obsessive quest. He pulled down ancient, leather-bound tomes, their pages brittle and yellowed, the air filling with the dry, musty scent of decaying paper and forgotten knowledge. He searched for any mention of his great-uncle Alistair's peculiar interests, any catalog of the manor's contents, any clue, however faint, that might shed light on the origins of the curse painting. Days blurred into nights as he pored over crumbling texts, his youthful eyes sharp and unnaturally bright. Scanning dense passages of archaic script, he found his great-uncle's journals, meticulously kept but written in a spidery, almost indecipherable hand, filled with cryptic references to correspondences, elemental forces, and the binding of sympathies. There were unsettling diagrams, astrological charts, and oblique allusions to the vessel of transferred vitality. Chills ran down Adrian's spine as he deciphered these fragmented clues, recognizing the horrifying echoes of his own experience. His great-uncle, it seemed, had been far more than just an eccentric recluse. He had been a dedicated practitioner of arcane, perhaps forbidden, arts. The portrait, Adrian began to suspect, was not a random acquisition, but a deliberately sought-after artifact, a key component in some terrible, life-altering experiment. His research led him beyond his great-uncle's personal papers, into older, darker volumes that Alistair Thorne had evidently collected from obscure sources. He found texts on necromancy, on the creation of talismans, on the nature of curses and soul-binding. In a particularly ancient and unsettling grimoire, bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin, he found a chapter detailing artifice of the anima transference, which described, in horrifyingly precise detail, the methods by which a skilled practitioner could imbue an artwork with the power to steal and store life force, granting extended youth to its possessor at the cost of the depicted subject, or, in some cases, by drawing vitality from other living beings. The descriptions of the rituals involved, the rare and repellent ingredients required, the infernal pacts that often underpinned such enchantments, filled Adrian with a mixture of revulsion and a terrifying, dawning understanding. This was not some random, inexplicable phenomenon. This was a deliberate, crafted malevolence. The portrait was a prison, a trap, and he was inextricably caught within its web. He found no easy answers, no simple spells for breaking the curse. The text spoke of such enchantments being incredibly difficult, often impossible to undo, their power rooted in fundamental laws of sympathetic magic and blood sacrifice. Some hinted that the only way to sever the connection was to destroy the artifact utterly. But even this was fraught with peril, often resulting in the immediate and catastrophic backlash of stolen time upon the beneficiary. His quest for knowledge extended beyond the confines of Blackwood Manor. Driven by a desperate hope, he risked using the old, crackling telephone line in his Grey-Tunkel study, a relic he hadn't touched since his arrival, to contact a handful of obscure occult experts and antiquarian specialists whose names he had gleaned. From Alistair's correspondence or his own distant academic past. His inquiries were veiled, cautious, speaking of a hypothetical cursed artifact, an artwork with unusual properties. Most dismissed him as a crank or a time waster. One, however, an elderly, reclusive scholar named Dr. Erasmus Valerius, whose expertise lay in pre-Enlightenment esoteric art, listened with a chilling, unnerving attentiveness. After Adrian's halting description of the portrait and its effects, there was a long, crackling silence on the line. Then Valerius's voice, dry and raspy as autumn leaves, spoke. "You are describing something I have only encountered in the most forbidden and apocryphal texts, Mr. Thorne. A true eater of years. Such objects are exceedingly rare and invariably hungry. Be warned, they do not relinquish their hold easily, and their appetites, once whetted, tend to grow." Valerius offered no solutions, only a stark, chilling confirmation of Adrian's worst fears. He hung up the phone, his hand trembling, the scholar's words echoing in the oppressive silence of the study. The unspeakable was being spoken, the unimaginable was real, and he, Adrian Thorne, was bound to a hungry, ancient evil, its tendrils wrapped not just around his life, but around his very soul. The flickers of fading youth were a warning, a sign that the portrait's demands were escalating, and his desperate search for knowledge had only deepened the shadows of his terrifying predicament. Chapter 10. The Portrait's Demands. Dr. Valerius's chilling words proved prophetic. The flickers of waning vitality that had so terrified Adrian became more frequent, more pronounced. The surges of unnatural youth that had once been his constant state now seemed to require a more conscious, almost deliberate effort to maintain, as if he were engaged in a constant, silent tug-of-war with a painting for his own life force. The portrait itself, a skeletal horror that seemed to writhe with an inner, unholy light, appeared to grow subtly stronger, more defined. After each of these episodes, as if it were actively drawing sustenance from his moments of weakness. Its malevolence was no longer passive. It felt targeted, hungry, a psychic pressure emanating from the canvas that was almost palpable. Adrian felt its silent, insistent demand in the very air of Blackwood Manor, a chilling, unspoken ultimatum. Feed me, or fade. The ambient life force it had once passively siphoned from him, the years it had stolen, the memories it had consumed, even the small life of Cinder. These were no longer enough to satisfy its ancient, insatiable hunger. It craved more. The grounds of Blackwood Manor, already desolate and neglected, became a veritable charnel house. Small animals, squirrels, rabbits, birds that strayed too close to the house were found dead, their bodies shriveled and desiccated, mirroring the horrifying fate of Cinder. It was as if an invisible perimeter of death radiated outwards from the study, a zone where life was systematically extinguished to fuel the cursed artifact within. Adrian would find these small, withered corpses on his reluctant walks through the grounds, each discovery a fresh stab of horror and guilt. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that their tiny life forces were being drawn into the painting, converted into the precious vitality that kept him young. He was living on a diet of stolen lives, a vampire by proxy, his youth sustained by a growing mound of innocent dead. The nights became a new torment. His dreams, once filled with the vibrant, if unsettling, memories of the portrait's original subject, were now invaded by the painting itself. He would dream of the skeletal figure on the canvas, its empty eye sockets blazing with an infernal light, its lipless mouth whispering silent, terrible demands. It would show him visions of his own accelerated aging, his skin wrinkling and decaying in moments, his hair turning white and falling out, his body crumbling to dust, all while the portrait laughed. A silent, skeletal rictus of triumph. He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, the phantom sensation of decay clinging to his skin, rushing to the nearest mirror to reassure himself that his youth was still intact, that the nightmare had not become reality. His physical appearance, though still outwardly perfect, began to show subtle signs of strain. There was a new, almost febrile brightness in his eyes, a hint of desperation lurking beneath the surface of his flawless features. His movements, though still graceful, were sometimes marked by a sudden, jerky tension, as if he were constantly fighting an unseen force. The stolen youth felt less like a gift and more like a precarious, constantly threatened illusion. One evening, while in the study, staring with a mixture of loathing and dependence at the portrait, he felt a particularly violent flicker. A wave of dizziness and weakness so profound washed over him that he had to grip the mantelpiece for support. The room seemed to sway, the colors of the portrait blurring before his eyes. He felt a coldness seep into his bones, a terrifying premonition of encroaching age. In that moment of weakness, he saw it, or believed he saw it. The skeletal figure on the canvas seemed to lean forward, its shadowy form almost detaching itself from the background, its empty eye sockets fixed on him with an almost tangible hunger. And he felt a psychic pull, a violent, draining sensation, as if his very life force was being ripped from him. He cried out a strangled gasp and stumbled back, his hand flying to his chest. The sensation passed as quickly as it had come, leaving him shaken and breathless. But when he dared to look at the portrait again, he could have sworn it looked stronger. The infernal light in its eyes burned brighter. The skeletal form seemed more substantial, less ethereal. It had fed directly from him. The horrifying realization struck Adrian with the force of a physical blow. The portrait was no longer content with passive absorption, with the slow decay of its surroundings. It now required a more direct, a more conscious offering. It was demanding his life force, actively, aggressively. The implications were terrifying. How long could he sustain such a direct drain? What would happen when his own vitality was insufficient to satisfy its ever-growing hunger? Would it then turn its attention elsewhere? Would it demand more? The thought, too horrific to fully articulate even in the privacy of his own mind, nevertheless loomed, a monstrous, unspoken question. Was he merely a conduit, a temporary vessel, until the painting required a fresher, more potent source? The life of a human being? He recoiled from the idea, his mind reeling. He was a monster, yes, a parasite living on stolen time. But he was not a murderer. Or was he? Had he not already sanctioned, by his inaction, the deaths of countless small creatures? Where was the line? And was he strong enough to resist if the painting pushed him across it? He felt trapped, cornered, a puppet dancing to the tune of an ancient, malevolent intelligence. His stolen youth, once his greatest treasure, now felt like a terrible, binding chain, linking him to a fate that grew more horrifying with each passing day. The portrait's demands were clear, its hunger palpable, and Adrian Thorne, for all his unnatural vitality, felt his own will, his own humanity, crumbling under the weight of its insatiable, terrifying need. Chapter 11. Cracks in the facade. The illusion, so carefully constructed, so desperately maintained, finally shattered. It happened not in a moment of dramatic confrontation, but in a quiet, insidious accumulation of horrors, a slow, dawning realization that the youth he wore was no longer a prize, but a grotesque mask, a visible brand of his damnation. The constant, gnawing hunger of the portrait, its escalating demands, the ever-present fear of the flickers that threatened to unravel his stolen vitality. These had ground down his resilience, his capacity for self-deception. The cold detachment that had characterized him for so long began to crack. revealing the raw, terrified core of the man he had once been, a man now irrevocably lost. He would catch his reflection in the tarnished mirrors of Blackwood Manor, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he truly saw himself. Not the handsome, ageless youth, but the creature lurking behind the eyes, a being hollowed out, haunted, his gaze holding not the fire of vitality, but the chilling emptiness of a soul bartered away for a fleeting, unnatural existence. The beauty he saw was a lie, a borrowed, painted thing, and beneath it, he felt the gnawing void where his own identity, his own memories, his own humanity had been consumed. The stolen youth, which had once seemed like the ultimate triumph over mortality, now felt like a cruel, mocking parody of life. It was a vibrant, animated corpse he inhabited, a beautiful shell with a rotten core. The weight of his actions, the cumulative tally of sacrifices made to sustain his unnatural state, pressed down on him with an almost physical force. The desiccated bodies of the small animals he found on the grounds were no longer just unfortunate casualties. They were indictments, each one a testament to the monstrousness of his bargain. The memory of Cinder, once suppressed, returned with a vengeance, a sharp, stabbing pain of guilt and loss that the intervening months of cold detachment could not numb. He remembered the warmth of its small body, the rough comfort of its purrs, and the image of its shriveled, lifeless form became a recurring torment. But it was more than just the animal lives. It was the stolen memories, the excised pieces of his own past, that now haunted him with their absence. He would try to recall his mother's face, the sound of his father's laughter, the specific joy of a childhood achievement, only to find nothing. Blank spaces, empty rooms in the mansion of his mind. He was a man without a past, a beautiful, youthful cipher, his history rewritten, or rather, erased by the insatiable hunger of the cursed canvas. This realization, more than any other, brought with it a profound, soul-crushing despair. What was the point of eternal youth if it meant an eternity of emptiness, an eternity devoid of the very experiences and connections that gave life meaning? He found himself drawn, almost against his will, to the study, not to bask in the portrait's power, but to confront the source of his damnation. He would stand before the horrifying canvas, no longer with revulsion or a twisted sense of triumph, but with a kind of weary, horrified recognition. The skeletal figure, with its burning, empty eyes and its silent, screaming rictus, was no longer just an external horror. It was a reflection. It was the truth of what he had become, stripped bare of all illusion. The painting was not just a cursed artifact. It was a mirror image of his own corrupted soul, a visual testament to the Faustian pact he had made. The beautiful, vibrant youth he wore was the painted lie. The skeletal horror on the canvas was the hideous reality. In those moments of clarity, the desire for youth, the desperate clinging to his unnatural vitality, was extinguished, replaced by a profound, overwhelming weariness, a yearning for an end to the torment, for escape, for oblivion, or, in his wildest, most desperate imaginings, for some impossible redemption. He saw the true, monstrous nature of the exchange, not as a clever trick played on time, but as a complete and utter surrender to a parasitic evil that consumed everything it touched. The gilded cage had become a torture chamber, and he, its sole, willing prisoner. The facade had cracked, revealing the desolation within, and Adrian Thorne, for the first time in a very long time, began to understand the true, terrifying cost of the portrait's price. Chapter 12, Confronting the Canvas. The gnawing despair that had consumed Adrian Thorne finally coalesced into a single, desperate resolve. He could not continue like this. The hollow charade of his stolen youth, the constant, sickening demands of the portrait, the ever-present fear of its monstrous hunger. It was an unlivable existence, a slow, agonizing descent into utter damnation. The brief, flickering hope for redemption was a fool's dream, he knew, but the desire for an end, for a cessation of the horror, became an all-consuming fire. He would destroy the painting. He would sever the unnatural bond that chained him to its evil, whatever the cost to himself. If it meant an instant, horrifying reversion to his true age, or even beyond, so be it. If it meant death, then death would be a release from this living hell. The fear of losing his youth, once his most potent motivator, was now eclipsed by the terror of continuing to live as he was, a beautiful, soulless husk tethered to a monstrous artifact. Fueled by this grim, newfound purpose, Adrian began to prepare for his final confrontation. He ransacked the manor's library once more, not for understanding this time, but for methods of destruction. The ancient grimoires and his great-uncle's cryptic journals, which had once filled him with dread, now became his arsenal. He searched for any mention of wards, of banishments, of rituals capable of annihilating such a deeply entrenched, malevolent enchantment. He found references to blessed implements, to consecrated fire, to specific incantations designed to unravel an artist's dark magic. The texts were obscure, often contradictory, filled with warnings of terrible repercussions if the rituals were performed incorrectly. But Adrian was beyond caution. He was a man with nothing left to lose but his cursed existence. He gathered his meager supplies, a heavy wood-splitting axe from the old carriage house, its edge still surprisingly keen despite years of neglect. A tarnished silver candelabrum from the dining room, which he painstakingly polished, hoping its purported purity might have some effect. A vial of holy water he'd found, inexplicably, tucked away in a dusty niche in his great-uncle's desk, its contents still clear and strangely cool to the touch. He even found a small, leather-bound Bible, its pages filled with Adrian Thorne's spidery, questioning annotations, yet its presence, he hoped, might offer some small measure of spiritual defense. He chose his moment carefully. The dead of night, when a moon was hidden behind a veil of dark, roiling clouds, and the wind howled around Blackwood Manor like a chorus of tormented souls. The house itself seemed to anticipate his intent, its usual creaks and groans taking on a more ominous, agitated quality. As he approached the study, the axe clutched tightly in his hand. A palpable wave of cold, malevolent energy rolled out to meet him, pressing against him like a physical force. The portrait knew. The entity within the canvas was aware of his treasonous intent, and it was preparing to fight back. He kicked open the study door, the sound of violent crack in the oppressive silence. The room was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with an almost tangible sense of menace. The portrait on the mantelpiece seemed to dominate the space even more than usual, its skeletal figure radiating an unholy, pulsating light. The empty eye sockets blazed with a furious, infernal glare, fixed directly on Adrian. As he stepped into the room, the assault began. The heavy velvet curtains billowed inwards, though the window was closed, as if an unseen force were trying to smother him. Books flew from the shelves, hurled with vicious accuracy, narrowly missing his head. A chilling, multi-toned whisper filled the air, coiling around him like an invisible serpent, murmuring his name, his fears, his deepest shames, trying to break his resolve, to plunge him back into the abyss of despair. The temperature in the room plummeted, his breath misting before him, the cold seeping into his bones, attempting to paralyze him with its icy grip. The portrait itself seemed to writhe, the skeletal figure straining against the confines of the canvas, its lipless mouth contorting in a silent snarl of rage. Adrian felt a wave of terror, so potent it almost buckled his knees. The sheer, concentrated malice in the room was overwhelming, but he gritted his teeth, his desperation lending him a strength he didn't know he possessed. He raised the axe. "No more!" he screamed, his voice raw, cracking. "I end this now." He lunged towards the mantelpiece, swinging the axe in a wide, desperate arc, aiming for the center of the cursed canvas. But as the axe head neared the painting, it met an invisible, unyielding barrier. The impact jarred his arms to the shoulders, the axe rebounding as if it had struck solid stone, not canvas and wood. He stumbled back, his ears ringing. The portrait remained untouched, its infernal glow intensifying. The whispers grew louder, more taunting, filled with a mocking laughter that scraped at his sanity. He tried again and again, raining blows against the unseen shield, his youthful strength fueled by a madman's fury. Each impact was met with the same jarring resistance. The wood of the frame, he now saw, was not merely old and dark. It seemed to possess an unnatural resilience, harder than iron, resisting his most powerful blows. He threw the silver candelabrum. It clattered uselessly against the barrier and fell to the floor. He splashed the holy water. It sizzled and evaporated before it even reached the canvas, as if touching a surface of immense heat. The entity in the painting was toying with him, demonstrating its power, its invulnerability. Terrifying visions assaulted his mind, his own body shriveling, decaying, aging 1,000 years in a heartbeat, the portrait growing younger, more vibrant, feeding on his ultimate demise. The youth he wore felt like it was being physically ripped from him, the stolen years rushing back with agonizing speed. He could feel the lines etching themselves back onto his face, the stiffness returning to his limbs, the cold hand of age closing around his heart. The confrontation was not just a physical battle. It was a psychic war, a desperate struggle of wills against an ancient, immeasurably powerful evil. And Adrian Thorne, for all his desperate courage, was beginning to realize the terrible, impossible odds he faced. Chapter 13, The Artist's Damnation. As Adrian reeled from the force of the portrait's psychic assault, his stolen youth feeling as if it were being violently siphoned from him, his mind, teetering on the brink of madness, latched onto a fragmented memory from his desperate research. It was a footnote in one of Alistair Thorne's most heavily annotated grimoires, a reference to a rare counter-ritual, a specific method for unraveling soul-bound pigmentations when the artifact proved too resilient for mundane destruction. The text had been obscure, couched in alchemical symbolism and cryptic warnings, but one phrase had lodged in Adrian's memory. The Creator's lament, when spoken with true heart's blood, may unbind what artifice hath bound. The Creator's lament. The artist. The one figure in this horrifying equation who had remained a persistent, unnerving mystery, who had possessed the skill, the malice, the dark knowledge, to create such an abomination? In a desperate, last-ditch effort, fueled by the rapidly diminishing reserves of his unnatural vitality, Adrian abandoned his physical assault on the impervious canvas. He staggered back, his body racked with the phantom pains of returning age, his vision blurring. He needed to find a name, a connection, something to anchor the ritual. His gaze swept wildly around the study, a chaotic jumble of overturned furniture and scattered books. His eyes fell upon a small, leather-bound ledger he had previously overlooked, half hidden beneath a fallen stack of his great uncle's journals. It was older than the others, its cover brittle and faded, secured with a tarnished silver clasp. With trembling fingers, he wrenched it open. The ledger was an inventory, not of Blackwood Manor's contents, but of a private art collection, dated nearly 2 centuries prior. The entries were meticulously detailed, listing paintings, sculptures, and objets d'art, along with their provenance, and, occasionally, brief, unsettling notes about their acquisition. And there, halfway down one yellowed page, under the heading Portraits of Singular Interest, Adrian found it. Item: Portrait of Lord Julian Devereux. Artist: Ilera Vance. Note: acquired under unusual circumstances. Miss Vance, a talent of considerable, if somewhat morbid, genius, rumored to have bound more than mere likeness to her canvases. Lord Devereux, her former patron and, some whisper, cruelest tormentor. His reported longevity unnatural. The painting itself, it watches. Ilera Vance, The name resonated with a chilling finality. Lord Julian Devereux, the handsome, arrogant young man whose vitality Adrian had been consuming. The tormentor, the artist, a woman of morbid genius, scorned, perhaps, and seeking a terrible, eternal revenge. A narrative began to form in Adrian's rapidly deteriorating mind, a tale of passion, betrayal, and a curse woven with paint and infernal power. Alara Vance, wronged by her powerful, callous lover, had used her dark talents not just to capture his image, but to imprison his very soul within the canvas, condemning him to an eternity of watching the world from within his painted prison. His life forced a commodity to be siphoned by whoever possessed the artifact, an eternal torment mirroring the pain he had inflicted upon her. And she, the artist, had perhaps, in her grief and rage, poured her own life essence, her own heart's blood, into the creation of this masterpiece of damnation. This revelation, this sudden, stark understanding of the painting's genesis, provided not a solution, but a terrible, poignant irony. The curse was not just a random malevolence. It was a meticulously crafted vengeance, a testament to a love twisted into an all-consuming hatred. Adrian now understood the profound sorrow he had sometimes glimpsed in the portrait's eyes, beneath the layers of aristocratic arrogance and predatory hunger. It was the sorrow of Lord Julian Devereux, trapped for centuries, his youth stolen and restolen, a perpetual victim. And perhaps it was also the sorrow of Alara Vance, her own soul forever entwined with her monstrous creation. But the knowledge also offered a sliver of a desperate, almost insane hope. The creator's lament. If Alara Vance had poured her own essence, her own suffering, into the painting, perhaps her lament could be invoked, not by her, long dead, but by someone who now understood her pain. Her damnation. Adrian felt a strange, almost empathetic connection to the unknown artist, a shared experience of being consumed by the portrait's relentless hunger. He was no longer just a victim of Lord Devereux. He was a successor to Alara Vance's torment, another soul caught in the painting's web. The psychic attacks from the portrait intensified, as if it sensed his dawning understanding, his potential threat. The room grew colder, the whispers more venomous, urging him to surrender, to accept his fate. He felt his stolen youth unraveling at an alarming rate, his body becoming heavier, his vision dimming. Time was running out. He had to act now. Chapter 14, Eternity's Grim Canvas. Clutching the tarnished silver candelabrum, not as a weapon, but as a desperate focus, Adrian stumbled towards the portrait. The infernal light blazed from its skeletal eye sockets, the psychic pressure threatening to crush him. He ignored the pain, the terror, the chorus of mocking whispers. He focused on the name, Alara Vance, on the image of a wronged woman pouring her heart, her soul, her heart's blood, into a canvas of eternal vengeance. Alara Vance, he cried out, his voice raspy, weak, yet filled with a desperate conviction. You're suffering. I know it. He wronged you. He consumed you, as he consumes me. He pressed the base of the candelabrum, the closest thing he had to a sacred implement, against the impervious surface of the painting. By the heart's blood you poured into this canvas, by the lament of your betrayed soul, I adjure you, release him, release me, let this torment end. As he spoke the words, a strange thing happened. The furious, aggressive energy emanating from the portrait faltered, just for an instant. The infernal light in its eyes flickered, and for a fleeting moment, Adrian thought he saw not the skeletal horror, but the faint, superimposed image of Lord Julian Devereux's youthful face. His expression one of profound, agonizing weariness, and perhaps a flicker of desperate hope. And behind that, almost transparent, the ghostly visage of a woman with haunted, sorrowful eyes, Alara Vance. A new sound joined the cacophony of whispers in the room, a sound like dry, rustling silk or the sigh of centuries of imprisoned grief. Adrian pressed his advantage. his voice gaining a desperate strength. "Alara, your vengeance is complete. He has suffered. Others have suffered. Let the cycle break." He poured all his remaining will, all his empathy for the tragic artist, all his own desperate yearning for release into his plea. The portrait began to shudder, not with rage, but with a kind of internal conflict, as if the ancient enchantment that bound it was warring with itself. Cracks, like jagged bolts of lightning, began to appear on the surface of the canvas. Not the subtle lines of age he had witnessed before, but deep, physical fissures that spiderwebbed across the skeletal image. A low, groaning sound emanated from the painting, the sound of immense pressure, of something ancient and powerful beginning to unravel. The infernal light in the eyes intensified, then, with a sound like shattering glass, it exploded outwards in a blinding flash, throwing Adrian backwards. He landed hard, his head striking the floor, his vision consumed by swirling, kaleidoscopic colors. The psychic pressure vanished, the chilling whispers ceased. An unnatural silence descended upon the study, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing and a faint, continuous crackling like dry leaves burning. When Adrian's vision cleared, he pushed himself up, his body aching, feeling impossibly old, impossibly weary. He looked towards the mantelpiece. The portrait was changed. The skeletal figure was gone. The canvas was now almost entirely black, as if consumed by an inner fire, yet strangely intact. Faint, ghostly outlines of Lord Julian Devereux, young and handsome once more, and beside him, the sorrowful face of Alara Vance, flickered for a moment, like dying embers, before fading completely into the void of the blackened canvas. The oppressive atmosphere in a room had lifted, replaced by a profound, almost sacred stillness. The curse, it seemed, was broken, or at least transformed. Adrian felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it threatened to pull him under. He looked at his hands. They were no longer the smooth, youthful hands of his stolen prime. They were wrinkled, spotted with age, the hands of a man well past middle age, perhaps even older. He touched his face. His skin was loose, lined. His hair, he knew without seeing, would be white. The stolen years had returned, all at once, not with the horrifying decay of the portrait, but with the simple, undeniable weight of his true, natural age, perhaps even a little more. A tax for the unnatural life he had led. He was free, free from the curse, free from the monstrous bargain. But he was also irrevocably changed, burdened by the memories of what he had done, what he had become. Days later, Adrian Thorne, now a frail, elderly man, left Blackwood Manor for the last time. He had arranged for the house and its contents to be sold, the proceeds to be donated to a charity for artists struggling with poverty and exploitation. A small, inadequate gesture towards the memory of Alara Vance. The blackened, inert canvas of the portrait he had wrapped carefully and buried deep in the overgrown woods surrounding the manor, in an unmarked grave, hoping it would never be disturbed. He knew the story of the portrait's price would stay with him, a chilling echo in the quietude of his remaining years. As he drove away, he didn't look back. The future was uncertain, his remaining time likely short, but he was at last his own man, living his own natural life, however brief it might be. The question lingered, however, a quiet, unsettling whisper in the back of his mind. Was the evil truly gone? Or did such dark bargains, once struck, merely lie dormant, waiting for another desperate soul, another moment of weakness, to bloom once more upon eternity's grim canvas? And there you have it, my friends. The chilling conclusion to The Portrait's Price. A tale of desire, damnation, and the terrifying cost of cheating time. What do you think of Adrian's fate? Did he deserve his end? And what do you believe truly happened to the essence of Lord Devereux and Alara Vance? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows, please be sure to hit that like button, share it with fellow horror aficionados, and most importantly, subscribe to the Eli Nightfall channel for more tales of terror and unsettling audiobooks. Your support helps me continue to conjure these nightmares for your listening pleasure. Until next time, stay safe, and perhaps be wary of any antique portraits that seem a little too lifelike. Sleep well if you can.